Investigators on the scene of a drug overdose find themselves matching wits with a serial killer. Something in the water has killed an office worker in Arizona. Her colleagues are lucky to be alive. Now detectives must decipher a mass poisoner's chilling agenda. When a healthy woman is found dead in her bath, investigators know she didn't drown on her own. Chemistry confirms there's more here than meets the eye. But can it lead them to the killer? Our material world is built on just 113 kinds of atoms. Their combinations can produce a world of good, but in the wrong hands, they're just bad medicine. At 10 a.m. on Saturday, December 10th, 1994, Detroit police arrived at the hotel suite of Lowell and Roberta Amos, just 1 block from police headquarters. Lowell had reported that his wife had overdosed on cocaine and was dead. Police found a cocaine straw and playing card in the nightstand, but no signs of the drug. Mr. Amos said he panicked and flushed it when he woke to discover that his wife was dead. To police, it seemed that Amos had done more than dispose of the cocaine. The room was neat as a pin, practically scrubbed clean. The bedding where the victim lay, however, was thoroughly soiled and smeared from side to side.
So how much more you got to work on there?
Though the victim wore no makeup, the pillowcase was saturated with cosmetics. When the medical examiner removed the victim, it was clear that she had been dead several hours before police were notified. Suspicions arose that there was more here than Amos was telling. Homicide was called in, and Lowell Edward Amos gave police his account of what happened that night.
I got it.
Roberta Amos was last seen with her husband in the hotel suite of his business partner, Norbert Crabtree, and his girlfriend, Darcy Smith.
We'll never notice.
Fine, thank you.
The event was the company Christmas party, and executives were given suites at the hotel so they wouldn't have to drive afterward.
More clients.
Though Lowell and Roberta Amos were unofficially separated, she agreed to accompany him to the party.
Lovely.
Afterward, Crabtree had invited Lowell and Roberta to his suite to continue celebrating. They stayed until 4:30 a.m. Lowell told police that after they returned to their suite, they made love and started doing cocaine. Lowell fell asleep while Roberta continued using the drug. He said that she had sinus trouble and couldn't snort it, so she found other ways to get it into her system. She must have overdosed while he slept. Because drugs were involved, he was afraid to call the police right away and flushed the remainder. But that didn't adequately explain why he waited so long to call authorities. Swabs taken from the victim's vaginal area tested positive for traces of cocaine. Other than that, there were no other external signs of the drug. That was strange. Internally, she had 14 times more cocaine than is normally seen in an overdose. She died before half of it was broken down. In cocaine poisoning, death is preceded by violent convulsions.
There.
Forensic chemist Phyllis Good believed that Amos could not have shared the victim's bed and slept through that. In fact, he probably couldn't have fallen asleep at all.
Well, cocaine is a central nervous system stimulant and has the effect of keeping a person awake and full of energy. It's not the usual case that a person would go to sleep right after they've used cocaine.
Get this sheet off of here. That should be the last thing we need.
Lowell Amos did his best to clean up the scene, but his story of his wife's death just wasn't washing. Now, investigators had to prove that he killed her. At the Michigan State Police Crime Lab, Phyllis Good examined the bedsheet to determine what caused the stains. Nothing in Lowell Amos's scenario could have accounted for their condition. Because the victim's body was so clean, they suspected that Lowell had washed it before he called police. Investigators hoped some evidence remained in the linens. The sheet was treated with chemicals to more clearly reveal the stains. Portions were cut out and labeled. Because the stains occurred on virtually all portions of the sheet, Good took samples from all areas. The same process was repeated with the pillowcase to see if anything besides makeup could be identified. The pattern of the smudges suggested that the pillow wasn't simply wiped across the victim's face.
What appeared to be lipstick, or characterized as lipstick, is that there is an imprint on the pillowcase of what had appeared to be imprint of teeth marks. And they are located in this area under the blue spot. The blue coloration is from laboratory testing.
Those don't want to come out.
People at the Christmas party told police that they had seen the victim wearing makeup. When her
Really?
body was found, she had none, but the pillow revealed she went to bed wearing it. Apparently, she had bitten hard on the pillow, or the pillow had been pushed hard into her face before she died.
Now, once we do
A bruise on her nose suggested that it was pressed with tremendous force. The samples from the pillowcase and sheet were sent to the State Police Crime Lab for analysis. Investigators awaited the results. Meanwhile, police interviewed Norbert Crabtree and a business associate. He admitted that on the day of the death, Lowell Amos had phoned his room at 8:30 a.m. saying he needed help. He wasn't specific. Crabtree, who was awakened by the call, didn't arrive until 9:30 with another business associate. Lowell told them that Roberta was dead and gave them a bag to hold for him. Detective Patrick Hennehan was assigned to the case.
The items were described as a washcloth from the hotel linen that was stained and very foul smelling, a sport coat, and a syringe without a needle in a small leather type carrying case.
Amos collected the items from his friends later. Investigators never recovered them. To determine what happened, they had to rely on the evidence at hand, namely the bedsheet and pillowcase. The lab results showed traces of cocaine throughout the sheet, but that was all.
The results of the test were the lack of urine or presence of urine, the lack of semen or seminal fluid, and the only thing that was identified in the brown areas was characterized as vegetative matter.
The identity of the brown stains was inconclusive. They shed no light on what happened, only deepening the mystery. The fact that the cocaine was also smeared around the sheet and tucked under the sides merely told investigators what they already knew, that Lowell Amos had manipulated the scene. either out of fear of being blamed for contributing to his wife's death, or to hide the evidence that proved he murdered her. As investigators mulled over which it could be, Lowell Amos's past began to catch up with him. It seemed that Amos may have been a real lady killer. As word spread of the investigation into the death of Roberta Amos, investigators in Detroit learned much about the suspect, Lowell Amos. He had an unsettling history with women. Two came forward who said that before he married Roberta, they met him at a bar, had drinks with him, and woke up in his apartment with no recollection of how they had gotten there. Other women reported becoming violently ill after being intimate with him. They claimed they'd been drugged. But the most astonishing revelations were yet to come.
I began to receive phone calls from relatives, received phone calls from doctors, private investigators, police officers, friends from as far away as Oregon. Most of the information that was coming in was in regards not just to Roberta Maury Amos, but also her husband Lowell Amos. I was advised that this was not his first wife to die at a young age under suspicious circumstances.
None of the deaths were considered criminal at the time. But times had changed, and the death of Roberta Amos shed new light on old events. In 1994, Michigan amended its rules of evidence. Past incidents could now be entered into a current criminal trial. If Amos's dark history could be shown to have some bearing on Roberta's death, the case against him would be the first one tried under the new rules. Nancy Westveld, assistant prosecuting attorney for Wayne County, Michigan, was brought in to see if the rules applied to Lowell Edward Amos.
If somehow we could demonstrate what Mr. Amos's real intentions were by looking back and looking at these other women, looking at their lives, looking at their deaths, looking at how Ed Amos had treated them, and in the end, what he did to them as they died.
The first Mrs. Amos, Sandra Amos, died in 1979 at age 36. The couple had been married 9 years. According to Lowell, Sandra mixed Dalmane, a sedative, with wine and must have collapsed and hit her head on the bathroom counter. Though Sandra's autopsy revealed traces of Dalmane and alcohol in her system, it wasn't enough to incapacitate her. Most of the drug was still in her stomach, undigested. She showed only a small abrasion over her eye, not enough to knock her out or kill her. Her cause of death was undetermined. The circumstances were not suspicious enough to launch an investigation. However, in hindsight, one detail stood out. After Sandra was taken away, a neighbor walked in to find Amos burning something in the fireplace. He told the neighbor it was his wife's clothes, bloodied from her accident. But whatever killed Sandra left no bleeding cuts or lacerations. There was no blood at the scene, and she was taken away in the clothes she was wearing when she died.
So the question became for us, what was Ed burning in the fireplace? And why was it so important that he get it destroyed before anyone saw exactly what it was?
Lowell Edward Amos received $350,000 as beneficiary of his first wife's insurance. Shortly after came wife number 2, Carolyn Amos, Lowell's mistress while he was married to Sandra. Their marriage was rocky. The friction point was the huge insurance policies Lowell kept taking out on his new wife. When he would not drop these policies in 1988, Carolyn threw him out of the house. He went to live with his mother, Mary Tolles, age 76. He stayed with her approximately 2 weeks when she became ill and was brought to the emergency room. Her doctor commented that it appeared as though she was drugged, but none of the medications prescribed to her could account for her disorientation. At the hospital, she began to recover and was sent home. Carolyn Amos phoned Mary Tolles every day to check up on her. A few weeks after Tolles returned from the hospital, Carolyn's call was answered by Lowell, who had just discovered that his mother was dead, apparently for several hours. Carolyn raced over to the house with a friend to find Lowell packing his belongings into his car. He didn't want anyone to know he was living there. Lowell inherited more than $1 million from his mother's estate. No autopsy was performed on Mary Tolles because of her age. Carolyn let Lowell move back into the house. 9 months later, in the spring of 1989, Carolyn, too, was dead. According to Lowell's report to police, he brought Carolyn a glass of wine while she was in the bathroom blow-drying her hair. When he went to check on her later, he found her dead on the bathroom floor, eerily like his first wife. It took a while for medical assistants to arrive at their secluded house. By then, it was too late to revive her. Amos suggested that she may have been electrocuted from the blow dryer. An examination of the cord showed that it had been cut, but Carolyn wasn't electrocuted. Her cause of death was never determined. Though the case was never pursued, the medical crew found inconsistencies at the scene. The wine glass was missing, found later rinsed and in the dishwasher, and the position of the victim's body suggested that she had been moved.
Her pajama top and her pajama pants were up at the ends, both at the bottoms of her feet as well as at her waist, hitched up, as it were, as if she had been moved. Certainly not in a position they would have been if she had crumpled to the floor.
Lowell received $800,000 from his second wife's insurance policies. For investigators, Lowell Amos was the kiss of death to the women he purportedly loved. Detective Hennehan believed it had to be more than coincidence.
I have had 3 close relatives of mine that have died. I've never been within 500 miles of any one of them when they died. Lowell Amos was in the company of all 4 of these persons when they died. He benefited emotionally and financially from their deaths.
Like the other deaths, Roberta Amos lay dead for some time before authorities were notified.
Ed wanted to make sure that each of these women was beyond help. He wanted to make sure none could be resuscitated, none could be medically brought back to life, because he wanted all of these women dead.
Though Roberta Amos's marriage was failing, she enjoyed a measure of professional success. Shortly before her death, she had purchased a house with her own money. Her plan was to legally end her marriage to Lowell and make a fresh start. Though Lowell Edward Amos had no financial stake in her death, investigators believed that he couldn't stand the idea that she had rejected him. The similarities between the death of Roberta Amos and Lowell's other wives was enough to expose him as an opportunistic serial killer who murdered for money or just to end an inconvenient marriage. Based on the collected evidence and the ghosts from his past, authorities had what they needed to arrest him for the murder of his third wife, Roberta Amos.
From the photographs of that night, Roberta Maury Amos looked happy. She looked like she was having a good time. She must have had hope for the future then. She shouldn't have.
At trial, the prosecution presented an account of the last night of Roberta Amos's life. After leaving Norbert Crabtree's suite, the couple went to their own room, where Lowell dissolved a large quantity of cocaine in water. He was somehow able to incapacitate the victim. Once she was subdued, he used a syringe to administer the lethal dose of cocaine. Then, perhaps as she was convulsing, he smothered her with the pillow. He then scrubbed the body and cleaned up the crime scene as best he could before calling Crabtree to dispose of the remaining evidence. For his crime, Lowell Edward Amos was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lowell Amos escaped suspicion through the subtlety of his crimes. But his past and forensics caught up with him at last. Other killers are more obvious in their methods, though they may be just as difficult to catch. Monday, March 24th, 1986, started out like any other Monday. By 8:30 a.m., the employees at the Transamerica Title Insurance Company in Tempe, Arizona, were already at the office. Their weekends a fading memory. Like her co-workers, 46-year-old Julie Ann Williams eased into the day with a trip to the break room. The coffee was on, but she preferred a drink of cool water. Just one sip told her something wasn't right.
Should I come with you?
She immediately didn't feel well and headed to the ladies' room. She didn't know it, but she was beyond help. When Julie Williams was found in the ladies' room shortly before 9 a.m., she was in cardiac arrest. By the time paramedics arrived, she had slipped into a coma. They rushed her to the hospital. Something was in the water. While the co-workers discussed what had happened, one of them, Diane Harry, was on the phone to her husband. She was more concerned than the rest because something similar happened to her just a few days before. By the time police arrived to investigate, Diane Harry's husband, Louis Harry, was already there, looking for what might have poisoned the water.
Okay, fine. You take care, okay?
But it wasn't just the cooler that was tainted. Tempe Police Sergeant Mike Palmer led the investigation.
I detected an odor within the room. Upon examining almost every cup or container of any type and the coffee pot that was in there, I could see that there was some type of substance in almost all of them. At that point, we decided that someone had purposely placed whatever this material was in these containers in order to injure people.
The office workers were lucky that no one else was hurt. But Julie Williams, after lingering in a coma, was not so fortunate. Whoever spread poison in the break room was now a murderer. Samples of the unknown poison were taken for identification. Police dusted for fingerprints, but no suspicious ones turned up.
We're only going to have it for a short while, if you wouldn't mind turning
The police interviewed the office workers. Diane Harry told detectives that on the previous Friday, she became ill after taking a sip of scotch at home. That Saturday, a cup of tea affected her the same way.
She remained ill the entire weekend. She barely could get out of bed. And she told me that the smell of the substance that she had inside her house in Phoenix was pretty much the same as the smell that was in the substance that was in the break room.
Questions as far as what happened with her.
She was concerned that she was the poisoner's target, which is why she called her husband to the office when Julianne Williams became ill.
I'm sorry. Sir?
Police talked to Louis Harry. He too was worried that someone was trying to poison Diane Harry. He said he'd been receiving threatening letters from the abusive boyfriend of a woman he'd helped. Perhaps this was his revenge. Louis was sent home to collect the letters, along with the scotch bottle and tea kettle, so they could be analyzed.
We'll certainly let you know.
Meantime, police collected the security cards that every employee needed to enter the building. Investigators suspected that whoever planted the poison did it sometime during the weekend. A check with the security company showed that only one security card had been used that weekend, at 10:18 on Saturday morning. It belonged to Diane Harry.
When I confronted Mrs. Harry about her card being the only one used during the weekend, she denied having used it. The only thing she could tell me was that she did not know where it was at, other than the fact it should have been in her purse, because that's where she'd placed it the last time she'd used it.
Ms. Harry, I just have a couple of questions.
The card was in fact in her purse Monday morning when she went to work. She insisted she'd been bedridden all weekend and never left the house.
It says that you checked into your office.
So far, all the evidence pointed to Diane Harry. But was she the prime suspect or the intended victim? It was too soon to tell. While detectives were trying to identify the criminal, scientists were trying to name their poison. Samples from the office water cooler, coffee creamer, and sugar bowl, along with the tea kettle and scotch bottle from the Harry's house, were brought to the Arizona Department of Public Safety Crime Lab, where they were analyzed by Supervisor Jim Timmons. He knew that the poison was a fast-acting white powder. That helped him narrow down his tests.
I really came up with a pretty short list of poisons that could have resulted in the information that I had heard about the case. And the short list was arsenic, strychnine, or cyanide.
Investigators applied a series of tests to the compound to narrow the list even further and to check and double-check his results. An ultraviolet light was shown through a solution of the unknown substance and measured on an apparatus called a spectrophotometer. Strychnine, which absorbs UV light, would give a reading. Arsenic and cyanide, which reflect UV, wouldn't register. The unknown substance gave a reading on the spectrophotometer, proving it wasn't strychnine. They then performed a test for arsenic. Samples of the substance were dissolved in acid, and a copper wire was placed in the resulting solution. If arsenic were present, it would attach to the wire and turn it black. No arsenic was present. The unknown poison in the office and in the Harry's home was most likely cyanide. To be certain, Timmons used a commercial kit for identifying cyanide.
It's actually a very simple test, but it involves some pretty complex chemical reactions. Ultimately, what happens is a red dye is formed if you have cyanide, and you test this on a paper strip that you drop into a solution. And in this case, it was positive, indicating cyanide was present.
To remove all shadow of doubt, Timmons further confirmed his results with a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer. The substance was sealed in a test tube of acid. If it was truly cyanide, it would form hydrogen cyanide gas, like a mini gas chamber. The gas was drawn off and injected into the apparatus. which confirmed that the cyanide gas was created. The battery of tests would provide essential forensic evidence for the courtroom if the poisoner was ever brought to trial. Timmons was not done yet. Cyanide most commonly appears in two forms, sodium cyanide and potassium cyanide. Both are equally lethal. A technique called energy dispersive X-ray analysis allowed him to simultaneously check for various elements in the compound. He found potassium. Samples from the office and from the Harry's home gave identical results. Both were potassium cyanide. The water cooler alone had enough cyanide to kill 150 people. The killer had set his or her traps in both places and cast a wide net to catch one victim. Diane Harry was either lucky to be alive or trying to disguise her role as the poisoner. The questioning continued.
I questioned Miss Harry about her husband's ability to get her electronic card that allowed access to the building, and she stated that he could have, but as far as she knew, it was in her purse. She indicated to me that she was not sure where he had been on that Saturday morning from approximately 9 in the morning until 12:30.
If Diane truly didn't use her security card on Saturday, perhaps her husband did. He was the only other person who would have had access to it. He said he was running errands that day. He couldn't account for his exact whereabouts at the time the card was used to enter the building. He insisted that the killer was the jealous boyfriend of the woman whom he had helped. He had the threatening letters to prove it. While the documents were being examined, investigators looked further into Lewis Harry's movements. Their quest took them to a convenience store across the street from his wife's office building.
We were able to find an individual who actually observed a black male subject driving a blue sports car, which is what Mr. Harry drove, enter at the approximate time that his wife, Diane Harry's key card was used to open the door to the business.
That gave investigators the leverage they needed to serve a search warrant on Lewis Harry's office. He worked in the athletics department of a community college. In the wastebasket, detectives found a label from a chemical supplier, some white powder on a bookshelf, and a small plastic knife, also speckled with powder that was later identified as cyanide.
Okay.
The cyanide found in his office didn't prove he put it there. A defense lawyer could argue that whoever tried to poison his wife also left cyanide at Lewis's office. But the next discovery would be much more difficult to explain away.
Also, there was a legal pad that we found that had the handwritten version of the threatening letters that had been mailed to him, the last few of the threatening letters.
The pad and a box of envelopes were brought to the Department of Public Safety, where they were analyzed by forensic document examiner Bill Flynn.
In many ways, handwriting is even more individualistic or individualizing than DNA for this reason. There are groups of people in society like monozygotal twins or identical twins who do in fact have identical DNA characteristics. However, in forensic handwriting identification, we've never found any two people that have exactly identical handwriting characteristics.
The handwriting on the letters was compared to samples of Lewis Harry's writing taken from business forms at his office and at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Flynn was able to say that Harry had actually written the drafts of the two threatening letters he claimed were sent to him. After he perfected his wording longhand, he typed the letters and mailed them. An analysis of the envelopes proved it. The letters that Harry presented to police were sent in slightly defective envelopes. The unused envelopes in the box confiscated at Harry's office bore similar flaws. Flynn exploited that weakness to strengthen his case.
A defect of the type that we had seen in that envelope was actually rare. The reason it was rare is that it would be severe enough to shut down the line. They would actually have to clear the envelope-making line and restart it in order to clear that type of error.
For Lewis Harry, the defective envelopes were especially incriminating. But they didn't seal his fate. Forensics had proved only that he'd sent himself the threatening letters. Now it had to prove he'd carried out his poisoned promises. To tie Lewis Harry to the poisoning of his wife's office, detectives needed to prove that he'd purchased the cyanide. They went to the chemical company listed on the label found in his office and obtained their sales records. The clerk recalled selling potassium cyanide to an African-American male. On the receipt, the name was Charles Holly. An African-American man named Charles Holly was contacted. He told police he'd never purchased cyanide. His signature wasn't close to the one on the receipt. Lewis Harry was asked to give a handwriting sample.
We asked Lewis Harry to write the name Charles Holly. He did do that. And from the earlier writings that I had in my office, and now with the new exemplars, I was able to identify Lewis Harry as actually writing the name.
That was all detectives needed to make their case against Lewis Harry. According to the prosecution scenario, Lewis Harry did receive threatening letters from the ex-boyfriend of the woman who was secretly Harry's new lover. The letters gave Harry the idea to write his own, more threatening letters and send them to himself, implicating the ex-boyfriend. He practiced his poison pen letters before typing them. When his attempts to poison Diane Harry at home didn't work, he secretly borrowed her security card, sneaked into her office, and poisoned everything he could find in the break room. He was a frequent visitor to his wife's office, so his fingerprints weren't suspicious. But when his wife called him after Julianne Williams was poisoned, he wasted no time coming to the office to leave even more prints while pretending to show concern. Diane Harry's trust in her husband was steadfast to the end. Throughout the investigation, she refused to believe that he could be the poisoner. Though she remained unconvinced by the evidence, the jury saw it another way. For the murder of Julianne Williams, Lewis Harry was sentenced to life in prison for first-degree murder, plus 105 more years for attempted murder. He's serving at least 95 years. Even after Lewis Harry's conviction, Diane Harry swore that he was a victim of circumstance. Her feelings changed a year later when her brother uncovered the box of cyanide hidden in the Harry's attic. For every criminal who thinks he's committed the perfect murder, there's a team of dedicated investigators out to prove him wrong. In Albuquerque, New Mexico, on the morning of March 28, 1990, 6-year-old James Woodward called his dad because he couldn't find his mother. The Woodwards had been separated for 3 months. David Woodward told his son to go to the neighbor for help. The boy told the neighbor that he thought his mother was locked in the bathroom, but he couldn't hear any sounds inside. She followed James to the bathroom.
She's in here. Go call 911, quick.
She jimmied the lock and found 30-year-old Deborah Woodward submerged in the tub. An odor like solvent hung in the air. The paramedics and deputy medical examiner arrived to study the scene. The victim showed no contusions or abrasions to suggest that she slipped in the tub.
Probably get a print of
There was
that.
nothing to indicate why she may have drowned,
Probably,
and there was no explaining the odor permeating the room. According to forensic pathologist Sparks Veazey, the situation was peculiar from the start.
A normal, healthy adult generally does not just drown in 4, 5, 6 inches of water in a bathtub. We look for some explanation for that.
At autopsy, blood was drawn and screened for alcohol, which might have contributed to the drowning. While a body is wet, injuries may be obscured, but as it dries, more is disclosed. As the examination continued, a chilling revelation sprang from the victim's own lips.
The examination of the inside of the lips showed injuries inside the lips, which were suggestive that something had been forcefully placed over the decedent's mouth and pressed into the teeth, causing injuries of the inside of the lips.
The case was looking more like homicide by the minute. The blood work showed no alcohol in the victim's system, but it did reveal a volatile substance similar to acetone, or nail polish remover. A sample of the blood was placed in a gas chromatograph to better identify the substance. It turned out to be ether. In fact, every tissue in the victim's body was saturated with it. Ether is a volatile liquid that can depress the central nervous system. Depending on how much is inhaled, it can cause dizziness, unconsciousness, or death by respiratory failure. It was once a common form of medical anesthesia, but was replaced by more predictable and safer methods. Ether can be produced in the body by the breakdown of some other chemicals or drugs the victim might have taken. Chief toxicologist Ronald Backer didn't believe this was the case.
But the fact that it was distributed in all tissues and in very high concentrations was a good indication that this was a significant substance that was not an artifact that really was involved in rendering her unconscious.
The victim had enough ether in her system to knock her out, but it was the drowning that did her in. This was no accident. While investigating the suspicious death of Deborah Woodward, police learned that she was separated from her husband, David. Even so, she shared her house with him until it could be sold. In an unconventional timeshare arrangement, their 3 sons stayed at the house while Deborah and David took turns living there and sharing child custody. The plan was designed to create some stability for the boys, but the friction between the couple lay just below the surface. Deborah had a restraining order preventing her husband from approaching the house while it was her turn to live there. None of the couple's problems escaped the scrutiny of Albuquerque police detective Damon Fay, who was investigating Deborah Woodward's murder.
Now I had to explore every part of her life, and I had to just open up all of the canisters of her life. One of them was her diary, particularly ghoulish to read because I could see the buildup of heading towards marriage with David, all of her excitement that goes along with that, the new marriage, the early years of it, then the deterioration of it.
In her diaries, which Deborah entrusted to a friend for safekeeping, she recounted the physical and emotional abuse that she endured.
Dave slapped me around in the bathroom, messed up my clothes, broke things. So much anger. Hell, absolute hell.
After the separation, Deborah tried to get on with her life. She began dating and was starting a serious relationship. But her husband was jealous, and she was fearful of what he might do. According to investigator Fay, she counted on her neighbor, a retired police sergeant, to keep an eye out for her, especially at night.
And had actually come to the rescue of Deborah on several occasions where she felt David had been skulking around, or she heard bumps in the night and wanted him to sort of investigate it. He would walk across the street and take care of things, walk around her house on occasion. So he had sort of passing knowledge about the domestic turbulence.
The neighbor told police that 6 months earlier, Deborah had noticed something odd in her car. He offered to take a look and discovered that David, an electronics expert at a garage, had planted a tape recorder in her car that switched on whenever the engine started. He'd also bugged the house and telephone lines.
There was nowhere in the house where she couldn't go that he could overhear whatever conversation was taking place. He could then take these tapes away and dissect them, go back through them, listen to them, and that would just infuriate him.
David was doing everything in his power to keep tabs on his wife, while Deborah devoted all her strength to making a clean break. It was a rough game of tug-of-war, and it looked like something had finally snapped. The neighbor told police that several days before the murder, he saw David Woodward dismantling the motion sensor spotlights he'd recently installed around the perimeter of the house. He thought nothing of it at the time. Now, it seemed too convenient. Woodward had the motive and opportunity to kill his wife, but where was the weapon? Though ether was obviously used to incapacitate the victim, it was the impurities in it that drew the focus of investigators. The killer had used impure industrial-grade ether, like the kind used in carburetor starting fluid. Considering that David worked in a garage, that seemed a likely source. If they could link him to a brand of starting fluid with the same contaminants in it, they'd be that much closer to closing the case. They tested every can they could find, with no matches.
Hey man, I was watching the show the other night.
As investigators were busy tracking down the ether, one of Woodward's co-workers contacted police.
Oh man, there's so many
He
ways.
told them that a year earlier, Woodward had
ever
talked
know.
about getting away with murder by using a volatile substance, like ether. Woodward claimed it would be untraceable. He was very detailed about it, but the co-worker wasn't paying close attention.
People out. And what you do is you spray it on like a rag and you put it over your face.
Based on this lead and the other circumstantial evidence gathered at this point, police obtained a warrant to search the garage.
How long did you stay there?
They confiscated an assortment of chemicals, including more cans of carburetor starting fluid.
We never did find any brand that was perfect, but we found some that were very close and ones that we could put a star next to as the possible source of the ether in the Deborah Woodward blood sample.
But in terms of evidence, it was enough. David Woodward was arrested. Based on the evidence, police reconstructed the murder of Deborah Woodward. It was the victim's habit to take a late-night soak after putting the children to sleep. While she was getting ready for her bath, David used his key to enter the house. He had already dismantled the motion sensors so he could sneak into the yard under cover of darkness. Once in the house, he saturated a rag with starting fluid, overpowered his wife, and caused the marks seen at autopsy. As the victim lay unconscious, David pushed her head below the water. He thought the ether would evaporate, and with it would go all evidence of a crime.
The truth of the matter is that dead men tell plenty of tales if you have a competent team of forensic investigators, which include the police at the scene, the autopsy people taking the samples, and the laboratory that analyzes the samples.
David Woodward received life in prison for murder and an additional 9 years for aggravated burglary for entering the home and battering his wife. No poison is perfect. The clearest liquid or finest powder still leaves behind its residue. And though the victim may at first appear unmarked, science can reveal how death was dispensed and dispense justice to the poisoner.